Alright, hello and welcome back to my channel or to my Facebook page. This video is a sequel to the previous one, which was entitled Learning English. That was the first of a series of videos that I intend to make, and this is the second. Before I start and introduce today's topic, I would like to touch upon a necessary idea, which is that everything that I say on this channel or on this page in these videos is only about language learning or language studying or learning a foreign language in a country where that language is not directly accessible. That is, we are not talking about language acquisition, which is the idea that I go and travel to another country, a country that speaks the language that I'd like to learn. For example, England or America or Dubai, for example. So I do not have direct access to the target language. Like, we do have access through the internet, that's true, yes, but that doesn't count as direct access. You don't deal in the language in your everyday life. The main language in my city that is spoken is Arabic. There's definitely a number of people that do speak English well in my city, but they don't speak it in the street, and they don't deal in it with other people unless they know well, and unless it's an informal kind of interaction. So again, we're not talking about language acquisition. We're talking about language learning a foreign language in a country where that language is not directly accessible. Now, the first thing that I'd like to touch upon or to talk about is organized learning. Now, when we talk about learning, you could learn a number of things. There is an infinite number of things that you could learn. And I'd like today to compare between learning a language, learning to speak a language, to use a language, let's say more broadly, and learning to ride a bike. Now, that's kind of a funny comparison because these are completely different skills, right? We could talk about how different they are, but the aspect that I'd like to highlight in their difference is that when I learn how to ride a bike, there is only a limited number of things that I need to know. For example, that I control the back brakes or the back wheel brakes with my left hand and the front wheel brakes with my right hand, and like that, right? So if I started a list of the things I need to know about riding a bike, I could write these two items at the top of the list. And then the list will grow and grow and grow and grow. And eventually, what happens is that the list will come to an end. There will be a point, and it's an accessible point, not after 100 pages, for example, like after 2 pages maybe. There will be a point where I say, well, that's everything that I need to know about riding a bike. Everything, right? Obviously, there's practice that is involved. Knowing alone is not enough. There's a practice. But when we talk about language, that's obviously not the case. Learning a language is not a skill that involves knowing a finite number of things. I cannot start by saying, for example, the first word in English is hello. The second word, or the second, let's say, part is how are you, for example. And then move on with that list, item by item, maybe sentence by sentence, or word by word, and then grammar rule by another, and then come to an end of that list by page 2 or 3 or 4. I would only come to an end of that list by page with a very big number, like page 200,000, for example. And that's the reason why we have dictionaries that are very, very big, right? They have like a very big number of words, very, very big number of language parts. Now, I skipped 2 slides here, one of them saying that obviously language is infinite, which what I'm talking about. The other thing is that the parts of the language could be thought of as being words and patterns. Now, obviously, I'm not a linguist, and I don't have expert knowledge in linguistics. I'm just a person that speaks a language, a second language well. But I'm definitely aware of the fact that there is a big debate between linguists as to what really constitutes the parts of the language. And some of them go with the idea that there are words and patterns. And patterns are things that, patterns we can say are ways in which words are put together in order to produce meaning. So we could say that grammar rules fall under the umbrella of patterns, okay? And obviously there are other things that also fall under that umbrella, which are, for example, idioms, and on like that. So words and patterns constitute the language, and there is an infinite number of them. So let's say, going back to our dictionary, you decide to learn a language, and you're faced with this idea that the language has an infinite number of words, an infinite number of parts. So what do? What you do is, for example, you pick up the dictionary and try to learn like a big number of words, let's say 5,000 words. And these 5,000 words are picked randomly. You choose them randomly based on some vague criterion that you have. Okay? You learn these 5,000 words very, very well, and you're able to use them. But the process of choice, the process of selecting the words, is a random process. So the question now is, does that make you like a good user of the language, having known these 5,000 words? And is it worth the effort? Because learning that number of words actually like requires a really big effort. And the answer is an obvious no. And obviously the reason is because the criterion of choice, or the criterion of selection, is a random criterion. When you're learning a language that has an infinite number of words, you need to have a criterion that guides you to the parts of the language that are most important for you to learn, and at the same time that are most easy for you to learn step by step, and for you to get into a process where you learn simple parts and then more complicated one, and on until you climb up the ladder to the top. So this criterion is, as you might have guessed, is commonality and simplicity. Now, talking about commonality, here I have a quote from an internet page which says, according to the reading Teacher's Book of Lists, the first 25 words in the OEC, which is the Oxford English Corpus, make up about 1/3 of all printed material in English, which is significant and dramatic, and the first 100 words make up about half of all written English. Again, the first 100 most common 100 words make up about half of all the written English. Can you imagine that half of a book, if you have a book that is 5,000 pages, half of it is roughly made up of a list of 100 words, a limited list of 100 words. And these are the most common words. So this is talking about commonality. Now, the other part of the criterion is simplicity. Now, here I want you to focus with me on the idea that we start with the basics. We start with written English or academic English. Language that is simple, can be written, can be understood, can be easily explained. And then, well, that language has words, obviously parts, and patterns, right? And they are usually regular. They are easily explainable. We can explain them. We have, subject, verb, all of that. And we have an auxiliary here, and when we answer here, and all of these rules and words, they make sense at a fundamental level. We make them easy. And then climbing from that, we go to things like scientific language. When you become very well acquainted with the written English or the academic English, you start knowing about different styles of language, different categories of language that require more in-depth knowledge. So there's scientific language, there is business language, specified at business or in business. literary language, even more complicated, and lastly there's spoken language, and these are just examples. And obviously all of these parts of or styles of language come back to the fundamental blocks of the patterns and words of the written English or the academic English. Now, for example, if I want to understand, scientific English, we say that there is a pattern that we already know in written English. It's very common in scientific English. For example, passive voice, right? We say that passive voice is common in scientific language because we care about the action rather than the agent of the action, right? So that's just one example. So we build on what we already know in written language and we climb up to other styles of language. And that's the way we do it. Now let's say, for the sake of argument, that I start my learning journey from up the top, for example, from spoken language. I get exposed to the spoken language, let's say, through movies, through songs, right? And that's a way that a lot of people follow, which I really disagree with. So, starting from spoken language, and spoken language obviously has words and patterns, right? But these words and patterns are not regular. They're not easily defined. And it's very difficult for me to define them in this form, in a vacuum where there's only spoken English and it has words and patterns. That's a very difficult process for me to follow. And there's a necessary need for written English and academic English for me to contextualize the patterns and words that go into spoken English so that I could more easily, fluently climb up to that place where I can understand the patterns and words that constitute this style of language, because I have a foundation that I could stand on, right? And that's actually the main point that I'd like to deliver today, which is that a lot of people seem to fall into this trap of starting their language journey, learning a language from a really high place, a place from let's say from a branch of these branches, which is, for example, spoken English, most commonly spoken English. They tell you, well, watch movies, listen to songs, but movies are songs, and songs is only a branch, and you don't have the foundation. And that will make your language learning journey, all of it, and your language very jumbled together and complicated to understand and contextualize in this way. So you'd have to go back to the written English, the academic English, understand the patterns and words, and then climb back up to the other styles or parts of language. Because it would be very, very difficult for you to go from spoken English and to a completely different branch, let's say to literary language. How are you going to connect these two together? It's very difficult to do that when the actual connection, which is the nowadays fundamental or standard written English, is not in the picture. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening.